One of the central notions of Christianity is the idea of original sin. It's expressed in Romans 5:12, which says, "Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. And in this way death came to all people, because all sinned." And this verse is referring back to the story of Adam and Eve, where they each ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, thus acquiring knowledge of good and evil, which made them sinners. And once they became sinners, they were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and their descendants were all tainted with original sin. And it's because their descendants were tainted with original sin that everyone is now deserving of burning in hell forever, according to Christianity. And it is through the atonement of Jesus Christ dying on the cross that we may receive the grace of God and go to heaven. And so this notion of original sin is central to the Christianity as is commonly taught. Now, one response to this is just to say that the Adam and Eve story is a myth that never happened, because in fact evolution is true and the creation myth of the Bible just didn't happen. And so we are not tainted with original sin, and we may discard all of Christianity because of that. And that's not the direction I want to go in this video. That may be a legitimate view, but I think that the story of Adam and Eve has something important to tell us. And I want to look at the notion of original sin not from an evolution versus creationism perspective, but from a moral perspective. The philosopher Ayn Rand, writing in the New and for the New Intellectual, is very critical of this idea of original sin. She says, "Your code begins by damning man as evil, then demands that he practice a good which it defines as impossible for him to practice." She's saying, if we are all tainted with original sin, we cannot help but be sinful. And it would not be fair to punish us for our sins if in fact it's because of this inherent evil nature of ours that we cannot control. She adds, "A sin without volition is a slap at morality and an insolent contradiction in terms. That which is outside the possibility of choice is outside the province of morality. If because of original sin we cannot help but do evil, then we cannot be held morally responsible for our actions. And so it would not be fair of God to send anyone to hell." But we should note here that original sin is specifically a Christian concept. It's not a concept from Judaism, even though the story of Adam and Eve does come from Judaism. So we may surmise here that the original authors of the story of Adam and Eve were not trying to account for the theological concept of original sin, but were in fact trying to explain something else. One of the things they may have been trying to explain is why we fall prey to sin and to immorality so much. We're often falling prey to things like anger and pride and greed, or envy, or gluttony, or lust, or sloth, or various other sins. These here are the 7 deadly sins, and I won't go into any detail about them in this video, but I have made a couple other videos about them, which you may want to watch here. But the simple fact of the matter is that even when we try to do good, evil can tempt us. We can be tempted into these sins. And they may have wanted to account for what could explain this. They may have also wanted to account for why is there evil in the world in general. The Greeks have a myth of Pandora. She was given this box, and the spirits in the box talked to her and eventually tempted her to open the box. And once she did, the spirits escaped, and that is what accounts for there being evil in the world. And here we have the story of Adam and Eve, where what accounts for evil in the world is that they gained the knowledge of good and evil through eating of this fruit, and were then capable of doing evil, and they pass that on to their descendants who also did evil. Now, I think there is a profound insight in the story of Adam and Eve that is not in the story of Pandora, and that is that it was the knowledge of good and evil itself that was instrumental in making them people who are capable of doing evil. And there is another interpretation of this story which I do not agree with. According to that interpretation, their sin was disobedience. And by disobeying God, it was for disobeying God that they got cast out of the garden and their descendants became sinners. I think that's the wrong interpretation. I think what is important here is that they acquire knowledge of good and evil through eating of this fruit. And I'll explain why. In the book Winter, Friendship, and Guilt, The Sources of Self-Inquiry, Michael Galvin writes, "By praising freedom, it can be seen that guilt and not choice lies at its basis. Unless one is aware of himself as a real and meaningful force which can succeed or fail, there is no meaning. To be guilty is what makes freedom possible. To praise freedom is to see it as that which makes men responsible, hence something on their own. Such autonomy may indeed require an abandonment of Eden and innocence, but it is at least possible now to be oneself, and if any kind of paradise is to be regained, it will be accomplished by men aware of themselves and free." Galvin is first pointing out here that freedom is a good thing because it makes our lives meaningful. Consider how much less meaningful your life would be if you lived simply as a cog or as a slave. It's through making your own choices that you give meaning to your life. He then points out that to be guilty is what makes freedom possible. It's through guilt that we're able to recognize the difference between good and evil. Here he's not talking about guilt as a fact about you after you do something bad, such as you are guilty of hitting your brother or kicking your sister or something. It's not that kind of guilt, but it's an interior sense of guilt where you can imagine doing various actions and have a sense of which actions would make you feel guilty and which actions would not make you feel guilty. So it's an internal understanding of guilt. And this is a loss of innocence. So you've acquired the knowledge of good and evil. When you acquire the knowledge of good and evil, you lose your innocence. And you become guilty in an ontological sense. This is not the same sense that you would be guilty of committing a crime, but it's a state of being. It's a state of knowing about guilt, of knowing about good and evil. And that is why the knowledge of good and evil is so important. It's through the knowledge of good and evil that we are capable of freedom, and that is what makes us capable of finding our lives meaningful. Without the knowledge of good and evil, we would not live meaningful lives. Returning to Ayn Rand's criticism here, a sin without volition is a slap at morality and an insolent contradiction in terms. Looking at the myth from the perspective that Galvin gives us, it's not about how we become shackled to evil and we can't do anything but. It's not how we've somehow now become inherently sinful, but it's rather about how we have become responsible moral agents capable of freedom. And that fits in with the idea that we have free will. And this criticism does not really apply to this understanding of the myth. Further on, Ayn Rand says things which fit better with what Michael Galvin has been saying. She says, "Their myth declares that he ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. He acquired a mind and became a rational being. It was the knowledge of good and evil. He became a moral being." And yes, that's basically the same thing that Galvin is saying, that it's through the knowledge of good and evil that we are capable of becoming moral agents. And without that, we cannot be responsible for ourselves. We do not have freedom. We do not have meaning, and we're not responsible moral agents. She also adds, "The evils for which they damn him are reason, morality, creativeness, joy, all the cardinal values of his existence." And this ties in with the spin that the Book of Mormon puts on what Adam and Eve did. And this is perhaps the only thing that I agree with the Mormons about, because I think, in general, Mormonism is a bunch of nonsense created by Joseph Smith. But anyway, here's what it says in 2nd Nephi. And now behold, if Adam had not transgressed, he would not have fallen, but he would have remained in the Garden of Eden. And all things which were created must have remained in the same state in which they were after they were created. And they must have remained forever, and had no end. And they would have had no children, wherefore they would have remained in a state of innocence, having no joy, for they knew no misery, doing no good, for they knew no sin. But behold, all things have been done in the wisdom of him who knoweth all things. Adam fell that men might be, and men are, that they might have joy. And here I have to credit Joseph Smith for recognizing that it was the knowledge of good and evil that is capable of making us feel joy in life. If we cannot tell good from evil, we can not really feel happy about anything. We cannot evaluate what is good and what is bad and know the difference. And so we cannot know the difference between suffering and pleasure. We cannot really know the difference between what is good and what is not. And without that, we cannot really feel true joy. With that in mind, the story of Adam and Eve should not be understood as the fall of man, but rather as the growth of man into adults. Telling about what it is about man, about human beings, that distinguish us from the animals. It's about how, unlike animals, we are responsible moral agents who are capable of living meaningful lives. And it points in the direction that we need to go in order to grow as people, to become better people, and that is through acquiring the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil is actually a good thing, which helps us actually become more like God. Not that there is a God, but more like the idea of God as someone who actually does understand the difference between good and evil, who is a responsible moral agent, who is capable of living a meaningful life. And if we want to live meaningful lives ourselves, it will behoove us to understand even better the difference between good and evil. And with that in mind, I do have other videos on ethics you might want to take a look at. For it is through knowing ethics that we better acquire the knowledge of good and evil, which is what will help us live more responsible lives, enjoy greater freedom, and live more meaningful lives, more joyous, more happy lives. And before I go, let me mention why you're actually looking at this picture of The Violet Apple by David Lindsay. This is a book in which some people grow a tree from one of the seeds of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then they eat of the fruit of that tree. And they acquire new insights into life and start leading radically different lives than they were leading prior to that. Prior to that, they were living worldly lives. One of the characters was making fun of another character. And after eating it, they start to live more spiritual lives, more simple lives. And this reflects the idea that through the knowledge of good and evil, we can actually live better lives. We can become better people and live more responsibly. That the knowledge of good and evil is not something inherently bad. It was important that we shed our innocence in order to acquire this knowledge, because it is through having this knowledge that we can live meaningful lives. Thank you for watching.